Welcome to the History Guy podcast, Counterfactuals. What is a counterfactual? In the context of studying history, it is a kind of analysis where we examine what might have happened had historical events gone differently. As a thought experiment, the goal is to learn and understand history as it is by talking about what it could have been. As a twist on the historical stories that we tell on the History Guy YouTube channel, this is a series of podcasts that dwell on that eternal question: what if? I'm Josh, a writer for the YouTube channel and son of the History Guy. If you're a fan of the channel, you already know Lance, the History Guy himself. To liven up our discussions on what might have happened, we have invited Brad Wagnon, history aficionado and a longtime friend of the History Guy, to join us. Remember that if you'd like to support us, you can find us on Patreon, YouTube, and locals.com. Join us as we discuss what deserves to be remembered and what might have been. On today's episode, we talk about one of the most important naval events in modern history, the pivotal Battle of Tsushima, fought during the Russo-Japanese War. This battle was crucial in the rise of Japan as a military and imperial power, setting the stage for huge parts of the 20th century. But what might have happened if it all went different? Without further ado, let me introduce the History Guy.
There are many battles in history which say changed the course of a war, but there are some whose impact is actually much larger than that. There are battles so significant that they changed the course of empires for generations. Some so important that they impact events half a world away. Some that so transform our understanding of the nature of warfare that they turn all planning and prediction for the future on its head. But battles like that are usually pretty well remembered, even amongst a population generally ignorant of history. Battles that important are heavily studied and well known, but some are surprisingly forgotten, or at least forgotten outside the area in which the battle was fought. And one such battle was fought May 27th and 28th of 1905. The Battle of Tsushima is a largely obscure battle in an almost forgotten war that was overshadowed by the much larger world wars of the 20th century. And yet, the Battle of Tsushima is perhaps one of the most influential naval battles in history, and it deserves to be remembered. By the start of the 20th century, conflict between Japan and Russia in the Far East was virtually unavoidable. Both were expanding empires with competing aims. Both more and more aggressively considered Manchuria and Korea to be within their spheres of influence, and both mistrusted the other based on race. Under Tsar Nicholas II, the Far East was the focus of Russian territorial desires. Russia sent over 170,000 troops to Manchuria as part of the international intervention during the 1900 Boxer Rebellion, and after the rebellion, most of those troops remained. Russia, considered one of the world's great powers, was considerably improving its ability to move troops to the Far East with the construction of the still incomplete Trans-Siberian Railway. The Russians had leased the warm water port of Port Arthur from the Chinese and stationed a powerful naval squadron there. Although the base was largely to counter British influence in the Far East, it was seen by the Japanese as a direct threat. And Russia was negotiating timber and mineral leases on the Korean peninsula, which they increasingly saw as being their sphere of influence. At the beginning of the 19th century, Japan was still a feudal state. But the Tokugawa shogunate collapsed in 1867, and Japan embarked upon a new era that, rather than rejecting foreign influence, embraced modernization and reform. This became known as the Meiji Revolution. The word Meiji means enlightened rule, and the goal was to combine modern advances with traditional Eastern values. The Meiji period resulted in many political and economic reforms, and transformed the Japanese economy and industry. But it also reformed the military, introducing not just Western weapons and tactics, but universal conscription. When combined with the cultural spirit of the samurai, Japan created a powerful, modern imperial army and navy, and a very militaristic society. As the nation grew, the leadership was keen to cultivate a sphere of influence that matched other great powers, and they, like Russia, saw it as their destiny to dominate Korea and Manchuria. Between August of 1894 and April of 1895, Japan had easily defeated China in a conflict over influence in Korea. The victory in the First Sino-Japanese War established Japan as the preeminent power in the Pacific. The conflicting interests in Manchuria and Korea made armed conflict virtually unavoidable, and while U.S. President Theodore Roosevelt tried to negotiate a peaceful solution, the Japanese eventually grew tired with the slow pace of the negotiations and in February of 1904 declared war on Russia. The Japanese launched a surprise attack on the Russian fleet at Port Arthur before the Russians had even gotten word of the declaration of war. To the surprise of the West, who thought Russia the superior power, most of the actual fighting in the Russo-Japanese War favored the Japanese. The Japanese were able to first bottle up the Russian fleet in Port Arthur and eventually capture the fortress. For its part, Russia fought mostly for delay, needing time to move reinforcements across the vast Russian expanse on the Trans-Siberia Railroad, which was not yet fully complete. With its Pacific fleet neutralized, Russia decided to send the bulk of its large Baltic fleet to the theater. But that was no mean feat. Britain would not allow the use of the Suez Canal, and even most Russian allies, like France, were technically neutral in the conflict, and there were strict limits on what aid they could provide to a belligerent. The fleet left in August of 1904, and after an 18,000-mile journey all around the tip of Africa, was approaching Japan in May the next year. The fleet was exhausted, and morale was low after the long and difficult voyage. The plan was to make for the port of Vladivostok to join the remains of the Russian Pacific Squadron, but that required that they pass through the Sea of Japan. On May 27, 1905, the exhausted Russian ships ran into the Japanese Navy as they tried to enter the Sea of Japan through the Tsushima Strait, located midway between the Japanese island of Kyushu and the Korean peninsula. It was an uneven battle. The Russian ships were in disrepair, the crews exhausted, the decks were covered with coal for the voyage. The Japanese not only had more ships, but they were more modern, had larger caliber guns, used newer explosive rounds, and had fresh crews. The first to go down was the Russian battleship Oslobaya. She was the first modern armored battleship to be sunk by gunfire alone. The Russian battleship Borodino exploded when it took a direct hit to its magazine. In the initial fight, the Russians lost a total of 4 battleships. The Japanese pressed a night attack using destroyers and torpedo boats. The Russian fleet became fragmented and several more ships were disabled. When the Japanese fleet caught up with what remained of the squadron in the morning, the Russians, realizing they were outgunned, surrendered. Only 3 Russian vessels managed to escape to Vladivostok. In the action, the Russians lost 7 battleships and 14 other ships sunk, with another 7 ships captured. While the Japanese fleet had sustained some damage, they had only lost 3 torpedo boats sunk. The lopsided victory effectively ended the war. The significant losses and increasing opposition at home forced Russia to sue for peace. Theodore Roosevelt offered to mediate, and the war officially ended with a treaty signed in Portsmouth, New Hampshire, September 5th of 1905. Russia agreed to vacate Manchuria and to officially recognize Korea as within the Japanese sphere of influence. Japan officially annexed Korea in 1910. For his efforts, Theodore Roosevelt was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize. The Battle of Tsushima was the only decisive naval battle in history fought primarily between modern steel battleship fleets. It was the first naval battle in naval history in which radio played a critical role, and it was the last time in naval history that ships of the line of a defeated fleet surrendered on the high seas. The lopsided loss so significantly impacted Russian prestige in Europe that it impacted war planning for places like Prussia and Austro-Hungary. And while it would be an overstatement to say that the Battle of Tsushima caused the First World War, it so shifted the balance of power in Europe that it made that war much more likely. The success of the larger caliber guns of the Japanese fleet convinced the British that battleships with bigger guns were more valuable than the mixed caliber batteries that had dominated naval thinking to that point. And that would give rise to a revolution in battleship building that started with the launch of HMS Dreadnought in 1906. And then that would lead to a naval arms race that increased military spending in Europe by nearly 50% and greatly contributed to the militarism that would eventually lead to the First World War. The significant losses of the Russo-Japanese War were a large driver of the dissatisfaction that drove the Russian Revolution of 1905, which forced Tsar Nicholas II to make political concessions and promulgate a new constitution in 1906. And that unrest and the resulting government oppression would then drive the forces that in the Russian Revolution of 1917 would dismantle the monarchy and give rise to the Soviet Union. The lopsided Japanese victory established Japan as a world power, but also strengthened the hand of the militarist in Japan and set Japan on a path of trying to dominate all of Asia. And that would eventually set them at odds with the United States and European powers that had an interest in the Far East, like Great Britain and the Netherlands. What's more, the Japanese were dissatisfied with the terms of the Treaty of Portsmouth, and they largely blamed the United States, increasing tension between the two. Russian participation in the Far East in the Second World War was largely designed around regaining the territory and influence that was lost in the Battle of Portsmouth, and thus the Battle of Tsushima set the stage for the Pacific conflict in the Second World War. The Battle of Tsushima not only decisively ended a conflict between great powers of the world, greatly enhancing the reputation of one and diminishing another, it changed the balance of power in Europe. It so changed understanding of military technology that it led to a worldwide naval arms race, and it set the stage for the events that would eventually bring the great powers into conflict yet again. The largely forgotten Battle of Tsushima, more than any other single event, presaged the world wars.
Now for the fun part, where I, the history guy himself, and Brad Wagnon discuss what might have happened if it all went differently. So today we're doing something a bit different than what we did last week, and as with all counterfactuals, it has some advantages and some difficulties. This one, I think, there are a lot of ways that this specific event could have gone differently that might have had very different impacts on the world, which is a little different than what we were talking about last time, where we kind of started talking about the kind of idea of how humans organize time.
How they work, yeah.
But I think that's what I mean. That's something great about this podcast, right? That we get to talk about either one of those.
Yes, definitely. This is a pivotal battle in what could be said to be a pivotal war, and so you can actually talk about, how things could be different in a very concrete way. This is just a sort of a way society organizes itself. But those are all interesting in terms of counterfactuals, right? And they help us to understand the history.
Yes, if you're not looking for variety, yes, you're in the wrong place. I'm sorry, I hate to say it, but
yeah, absolutely. This one is such an interesting battle, partially because it was so one-sided. Mm-hmm. I mean, there are a few battles that go as one-sided as this one did, and so when you're talking about counterfactuals, I mean, the big hump is how does this one go differently?
It is. Yeah, if you just go into Google and say, could the Russians have won Tsushima? What Google AI is probably going to tell you is no. They got their butts whomped badly. they lost their whole, that there was, but that's not really fair. Because that all takes us to the context of the Battle of Tsushima. But the Battle of Tsushima is a battle the Russians didn't want to fight. So the key to victory at Tsushima was not to have been at Tsushima. And I mean, should the Russians have sent the Baltic Fleet at all? Should they have sent the Baltic Fleet without having clear, repair facilities along the way? If they had made some sort of arrangement in China or Formosa or something like that for the fleet having gone halfway around the world to stop, to get better coal, to refit, to repair, to recover from tropical illness, etc., to rearm, then it could have been a completely different battle. So I mean, Tsushima as a battle was probably not winnable, but what Tsushima was, which was that conflict between the Russian Baltic Fleet and the Japanese fleet, could that have gone differently? Of course it could. Yeah. It was a battle that was fought completely in the way that best suited the Japanese, and that was brilliance on their part. But I mean, the reason it's so lopsided is because some battle's going to lose if you fight that battle. They had to have fought a different battle.
Yeah. Now, one of the things, just referring back to the introduction, it's interesting to me that this war is virtually a footnote in history, especially in the West. And yet, it does signal a seismic shift in the Far East. It is definitely a time in which, 30 years before Tsushima, Japan was largely an agrarian society in the midst of the Meiji Restoration, which, could have turned out very differently. And a nation that had no real heavy industry in less than half a century becomes a major player in the Pacific. And that's where I think that Tsushima, it kind of gets shortchanged, I think, when major conflicts get covered. But it really is quite major.
It is, yeah. And the interesting thing is Europe was sure that Russia would win this easily. So, I mean, this really does shift a change in Japan, and that does completely change the trajectory. So, I mean, in the simple sense, if you want to talk about counterfactuals, absent the Russo-Japanese War, then the Pacific could have been quite different. If Russia had won, as Europe assumed that they would, and just simply prove that the Asian powers were secondary to European powers, possibly Japan never militarizes. If Japan never militarizes, no war in the Pacific. Possibly Russia never has the 1905 revolution, which means that they possibly never have the October Revolution, which means that you don't have a communist Russia. You never have the peace pact with Germany. I mean, this war could say it's very easily to look at this war and say that the Second World War, I mean its impact actually on the First World War is maybe less, but in terms of the Second World War, then maybe the Second World War never occurs, or Russia never collapses during the First World War.
Although I did see some arguments that this might have helped. I think it's hard to say that this would have avoided World War One, but I did see some argument to say that it emboldened the Central Powers because, first of all, Russia's navy is totally destroyed. I mean, literally, every battleship they have is sunk. I think every single one is sunk at this battle. Well, is sunk in this war. Some of them weren't sunk at this battle, but they ultimately. It totally rearranges power in Eastern Europe, and this guy argued that essentially that it made it certain that the Central Powers would challenge Russia in the Balkans because they saw it as a significant sign of weakness.
No, that's a fair point. Yeah. And one of the things you can say about it is what if they just didn't send the fleet? What if the two guys looked at each other and said, "This is a ridiculous idea. Try to send our fleet all the way around the world. They're going to be exhausted and out of coal, and when they get there, and the Japanese are going to sink them all." So I mean, in the end, the war was fought and lost on land anyway. So what if Russia still loses the Russo-Japanese war? They just don't send their fleet to get sunk while losing the Russo-Japanese war. Then does that fleet make a difference if that fleet's intact, and might that have deterred the Axis attacks? I don't know. And it's also easy to see in terms of a counterfactual, because really kind of what happens in the First World War, the Germans are planning that it takes forever for Russia to mobilize. And what if the result of the war, or the result of a loss in the war, or whatever, what if the result turns out that the Russians modernize their military? I mean, then that could drastically impact, what goes. It might have caused a war to start earlier. Or Germany might not have been willing to mobilize on behalf of Austro-Hungary in terms of the Balkans because they knew that Russia was too powerful an adversary. So, I mean, there's so many ways that this war really could have changed the major events that are coming in the century.
Because it's not just that they lose the manpower and the ships. I mean, it was a significant loss of prestige. Because it made Russia just look like like a joke. It wasn't just. I mean, even if I feel like if this battle had been more even-handed, that wouldn't have been as bad. But I mean, this was a level of defeat that is seldom seen. They were just absolutely. I mean, they were dominated.
Especially with this anticipation that the big Russian fleet showing up was going to easily defeat Japan. Yeah, and so it was a major. It showed that Russia was a paper tiger. Yeah. And being a paper tiger certainly could have had a large impact on who fights the First World War. Certainly it has an impact later because that is part of what causes Russia to collapse and become the Soviet Union that we're seeing during the Second World War.
Yeah, and in World War One, can you imagine? Germany has a very significant northern coast on the Baltic. And when Russians went into East Prussia during the beginning of World War One, where they actually had a fair amount of success to begin with the knowledge that they had a functional fleet on the coast that could provide naval support, then there might have been there'd be some interesting counterfactuals where Germany is fighting for its life because East Prussia is lost, or the armies in East Prussia have ground to a halt, and a Soviet Navy, even if it is somewhat older ships, is able to make a difference. At that point, the Kaiser has to figure out, well, which direction am I going to send my fleet? Am I going to challenge Britain, or do I withdraw and turn the Baltic into a battleground? And
I mean, there was naval war in the Baltic in the First World War with the Russian fleet. So if it was much larger Russian fleet, it could have made a huge difference. And of course, part of the reason, Germany was building very hard on its fleet, trying to be able to challenge the Royal Navy. So having a larger Allied fleet there certainly could have changed how successful Russia could have been. And in some ways, their defeat their naval defeats in the Baltic, was part of what drove the collapse of the Russian armies and then into the October Revolution.
There were a couple other interesting connections to the World War One naval war that I kind of found some people talking about, and one of them was that the Japanese victory led the British, who, there'd been the Anglo-Japanese alliance before that, led the British to understand that the Japanese could protect the East. And so with the British understanding that, they were able to move more ships to Europe. And as they did that exacerbated the arms race between the Germans and the British, because they both had these policies of how many ships they needed to have the advantage. And when Britain brings in a bunch of ships from the East, that just sped it up. It made it so that the Germans have to build more ships, which means the British have to build more ships, and it just kind of helped feed into that positive feedback loop. And that's kind of an interesting way to look at it. I also saw that, this is one of the first modern at the time, of course, battles between these steel-hulled fleets. And one of the things they learned was how that kind of battle works out and what kind of ships were best. One of the things they saw was that the Japanese ships, which were faster and better armed with heavier guns, the Europeans had this idea that you had mixed calibers on your battleships. That they essentially saw that wasn't really valuable. That you wanted the biggest guns you could get on your ship, and you wanted all of them to be that biggest gun, because that was kind of what they saw at Tsushima. As effective. There was a quote from a British observer who said, when the 12-inch guns are firing, you don't even notice the 10-inch guns. No matter how many of them are shooting, you don't care because the 12-inch are so effective. And so that changed how they started building ships, which impacted, say, the HMS Dreadnought. But it also led the Germans to be cautious about engaging in a major fleet battle. And so this battle might have impacted, because neither one of them wanted a Tsushima. Neither one of them wanted to march their fleet out and have it get absolutely wrecked by the other one. And so it might have led to some of the caution that we saw in the major, between the major powers in that war. And that's kind of an interesting take, I think, to say that we learned so much about it that it might have really told us how we were going to battle with those fleets, and in fact led us to those fleets essentially sitting in harbor for the whole war. With only Jutland as the real major naval battle in the Atlantic.
I like the possible counterfactual first one, where there's an alternate timeline where the British and the Japanese don't form the alliance of 1895. And the British decide that having a client state, essentially, or a proxy state, Japan, perhaps they should, pick another power. And they almost did. In 1885, they really were backing China heavily in the first Sino-Japanese War. But, it became fairly obvious that China was not the winner in this one. And so Britain needed a more reliable region. And, as a precursor to World War I, those danged entangling alliances, the French and the Russians, had they not been, had an agreement that Britain felt that they needed to somehow counterbalance, there's certainly, there's that's a path that I think is ripe for speculation. But the fact is, the Japanese did, they essentially copied the Royal Navy down to the uniforms, as well as the signaling. So, those were two good friends, and the production of the Japanese battleships they were actually British battleships.
Well, and Japan was not unimportant in the First World War. Actually, Japanese submarines, people don't know this, Japan sent submarines to the Mediterranean during the First World War, on behalf of the Allies. But one of the things that Japan, being part of the Allies, was in the First World War is that it kicked out the Germans from their bases. Yeah. And that essentially made the German Pacific fleet irrelevant. And so if Japan had not won in the Battle of Tsushima, if it had not won in the Russo-Japanese War, then maybe Japan doesn't play the role that it plays in the First World War. If it doesn't do that, then, who says where Japan might have gone by the time of the Second World War.
Well, because maybe then there were, German provinces, German territories in the East, which by World War II, I don't know if the Germans held on to anything.
No.
because they had
Yeah.
several at the time.
Yeah, they lost those
No.
largely during the First World War. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, Tsingtao, the Admiralty Islands, the Marshalls, and
And
parts of
there
Micronesia.
was a German
Um,
Samoa for a while,
Yeah.
around that time, but I
yeah, yeah, I believe
Well,
Samoa
so, there was
was also.
another island because Zeidler Harbor was Zeidler Harbor. Where's that? That was New Guinea, right? But yes, I mean they had, and we've had other episodes that talk about those German colonies there. So those are lost in the First World War, and those German colonies, perhaps if the Russo-Japanese War had gone differently, then perhaps Germany would have been better prepared to defend those colonies in the First World War.
Mhm.
If they still had colonies in the Pacific in the Second World War, what would that have meant? But going back to something else that came up, that it's kind of interesting. Is that we did learn, or the world learned, a lot about naval combat from the Battle of Tsushima and about what to
Yeah.
do with these metal battleships. And so, what if the Russians had simply avoided the battle and said, "There's no point in us sending a fleet around the world"? What if the war is fought on land and not has nothing to do with the Battle of Tsushima? Then does it change history anyway, simply because we don't have that battle to learn from? I mean,
Yeah.
it's interesting because you have these crazy steampunky looking battleships of the era,
Yeah.
and this is the really only good time where they're going to just kind of take those out and really make a huge old fight out of it.
Yeah, it's incredible how much ships changed.
Yes.
At the beginning of the 19th century, they were still wooden hulled masted ships, and by 1904 here, I mean they've been totally replaced by these steel ships with these huge guns that were essentially unimaginable. 50 years beforehand, and it's crazy how much that changed, and no one had. In fact, by the time of this battle, the only people who had any experience in the battle were the Japanese commanders who had been fighting, the Russian Eastern Fleet, the Russian Pacific Fleet, and the Russian commanders who had been defeated in the Pacific there, and so that was maybe one of the reasons why the Japanese did so well here is that the Russian commanders of that fleet had never fought a major fleet action like that.
Mm-hmm.
But it does make you wonder, if we don't have Tsushima, does that mean the major fleet action where we learn about these ships, is that coming World War I? And instead of just Jutland, we have, some absolutely crazy battle between the German and British
battle
fleets.
that everybody was predicting was going to happen.
Yeah. And
Yeah.
it's interesting to think about.
Yeah, I don't think that. And just to make sure to reinforce this, in 1906, the creation of the HMS Dreadnought obsoleted the entire navy of every single country in the world almost.
Sort of.
Actually,
A lot of those pre-dreadnought battleships still fought in the First World War, but I mean, it did. I mean, dreadnought changed, how people saw ships. It's certainly true. But part of that was Tsushima, which essentially taught you that all those mid-range weapons and all that stuff. Battleships used to bristle with weapons of all sorts of calibers. They deliberately used different calibers because that way, when you were ranging, you could tell which splashes were your splash as opposed to the battery next to you. And all that went away because they found out in Tsushima essentially only the big batteries counted. So it is fair to say that dreadnought changed everything. It's also fair to say that part of that was experience from Tsushima. And so do we go into the First World War with very different battleships? And if we do, does that change the war? It wasn't largely a naval war.
Now, there's another possible counterfactual that I think would be interesting to explore, and that would be, what if Makarov, the Russian admiral, is not killed, and what if the Russian fleet in Port Arthur actually makes a credible enough showing that the Japanese have second thoughts and decide to withdraw, and Manchuria and Port Arthur remain under Russian control, and Russia does not take the diplomatic hit to its reputation.
I mean, essentially,
and I
the
think
question
that's
is, what
where
if Russia wins the Russo-Japanese War? And I mean, if Japan's defeated in the Russo-Japanese War, does Japan become less militarized, or does it become more militarized? Is there a chance that and if they do, what does that mean for the First World War, and what does that mean for the Second World War? So those are good questions. But one of the things that's interesting is that war was not as lopsided as it looked, especially to the Japanese people. I mean, in the end, when peace is negotiated, which was actually negotiated by Teddy Roosevelt, but when peace is negotiated, the Japanese people feel like they have been burned in this peace treaty. They're like, this is not fair. We brutally won every part of this war, and now we're having to make concessions, and we're not getting everything we want. And that was partly because the propaganda, which was not atypical at the time, the propaganda had told them that they were winning more than they really were, that was true throughout World War One too. That's how everybody talked to each other, right? I mean, the Germans thought they were winning until the day that they lost. And so that there's some argument that Japan militarized more because they felt like in the negotiation for the treaty to end the Russo-Japanese War, that everybody had ganged up on them to protect Russia. And so, I mean, it's very, I mean, the whole diplomatic thing is very, very fussy here. So what if the Battle of Tsushima had not been so one-sided, that when the peace came, even if it came to the same peace treaty, that when the peace came, the Japanese people felt more justified in the way that the peace treaty was signed, then is that a different Japan? And does that affect the First World War? And does that affect the Second World War? Because all of this is part of this process of Japan militarizing. Well, at the same time, it's part of the process of Russia collapsing eventually into the Soviet Union. I mean, could you change those trajectories? Will those trajectories set? There's certainly things here that would have impacted the way that people were seeing the societies in both of those cultures. And both of those are things that have massive impacts later in the 20th century.
Because this war was expensive for everybody. It was hard on the Japanese people. It was very hard on the Russian people, and so it's harder to imagine.
Kind of sucked for the Koreans too, but and the Manchurians, the people that were stuck in the middle of it, didn't have a very happy time either. Right?
But I've seen some argument that if the Japanese had lost it as dramatically, even lost a battle as dramatically as say Tsushima, that could have led to a change of regime essentially, because they were. That's essentially what happens in Russia, if not directly caused, it's at least a step. Oh, yeah. It was a significant factor in the 1905 revolution. It was not not at all the only
factor in the 1917 revolution. Yeah, absolutely.
So it certainly played a part there, and so if the Russians are able to win it, that's where we talk about this idea that maybe they're able to hold together. I mean, one of the problems with Russia as it's collapsing is that the czars just lose confidence. The people lose confidence in the czar. So I mean, you could see that happening in Japan as well. I mean, they have a populace that was as much demanding success, and as you said, mad about the peace treaty. And that's an interesting take that I understand why they would think that way, because the Sino-Japanese War, the French and the Russians, the Europeans came in directly and essentially scrapped the peace treaty that Japan wanted and forced them into a treaty that really, really kind of screwed Japan. And so I can see why they were maybe sensitive to this idea of these other European powers and stuff coming in and not treating them as equals.
Well, everybody, I thought they were a second-rate power, so you can see why they felt like they had proven themselves.
Yeah, and it is.
But you mentioned the czar. I mean, monarchies did not survive the First World War, in terms of absolute control, because even the British monarchy was really just a figurehead by that point, except in Japan, right?
That's true.
Yeah. I mean, what major power in the Second World War had a monarch that had actual power other than Japan? So if the Russo-Japanese War goes differently and we get what if we don't have the power of the emperor in Japan?
Yeah.
I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt, Brad.
Yeah, I just wanted to follow on with the thought there that the Japanese were definitely greatly affected, and I believe that this is really one of the reasons where Japan grabs and plants the banner of anti-Westernism at the same time that it is doing everything it can to become a Western power. So it's part of the cultural paradox, if you will, of what Japan is and what Japan is doing at the time. But when you look at this as a lead up to World War II, you can see where philosophically the Japanese would say, this whole concept of a greater East Asian coast prosperity sphere with us as the undisputed top dogs of said co-prosperity sphere is definitely an ideology that is going to continue to motivate the Japanese military. And throughout the period leading up to Tsushima and post-Tsushima, the Japanese military becomes, I wouldn't say increasingly, but it is certainly, it's a loose cannon. It's a wild card. So what's happening during the interwar periods in China? It's almost as if the militaries that were occupying Manchuria, the puppet states, uh, essentially were okay. We really don't care what anyone else says. We are going to be the aggressors, and we are going to take the territories that we want. Tsushima is the first step of emboldening the militarist, and I think that you can get a feel for that going for the next 50 years until 30 years until finally the interwar period comes, and what we consider to be the setup for World War II is established.
There was an interesting take I saw, which was that Tsushima essentially set Japan up for the failure that World War II ended up being, because they gained an unearned, or maybe not totally unearned, but a kind of overzealous idea of how powerful they were. They start when you destroy a great power like Russia. Well, they really didn't destroy the whole power, but they thought they did, right? They got this idea that they really just absolutely dominated in that war, and they did dominate at this battle. They decide that means, we're essentially unstoppable. There's no fleet in the Pacific that can challenge us, and that maybe that was this kind of arrogance and this idea that they were the most powerful navy in the Pacific might have essentially given their generations of their officers and their commanders an idea that they were more prepared and less likely to lose than they really were. And I think there are some people who within Japan even who realized that that was they were maybe not as solid a ground as they thought they were in terms of how powerful their military was. But there's a good point to say that they see such an incredible victory here that it gives you a sense of invulnerability, and that might have lasted until World War II, which made them make some decisions that impacted how that war turned out.
Yeah, the simple reality is neither Hitler nor Hirohito and the Japanese military thought that they were going into a losing war when they started World War II. And
True, yes.
if you look at the actual history of what Great Britain, France, and the United States were doing, we were very preoccupied, obviously, with the economic catastrophe of the Great Depression. The flag of fascism was raised as counter to the democracies which were failing in the world due to their over-reliance on economics or whatever, and the concept of freedom. Fascism is the future, and this is not. Again, no one goes to war to lose, and no one goes to war unless you think that you've got a good chance of winning. And if you've got an unrealistic expectation of just how good your army is, that's a that's
the Russians definitely did going into this war.
Tsushima was part of Japan having this fantastic confidence that their fleet was going to be undefeatable.
In a tinier little piece of this battle, Yamamoto was at this battle, and he lost 2 fingers when on his ship. I think it was because a shell went off early or something like that. If he had lost 3 fingers, he would have been medically discharged from the army, from the Navy. And so he loses 2 fingers at this battle, and so he isn't medically discharged. And it makes you wonder, he plans Pearl Harbor in case there's...
He is certainly an important Japanese military leader.
Yeah. So, if he's taken out, even just by, a medical injury, you wonder what that means. Does that mean he has he's in the position by World War II? And that could impact it. I think that, to some extent, you'd say the attack on America was probably, if the Japanese are going into World War II with the goals that they had, they're going to have to make that attack somehow. But it might have impacted how they made that attack.
It could. Well, other things as well. You have to understand how fuzzy alliances were at the time, because when the Washington Naval Treaty, when we ratified that treaty, which included Japan and Germany and France and Britain and Italy, but the Washington Naval Treaty at the time, there was a concern that the naval buildup could lead to war between the U.S. and Great Britain. I mean, it was certainly not
Interesting.
set that we were going to wind up on the side of Britain and France in the First World War. It was certainly not set that we were going to be allies with Britain. There was a real concern that we could end up going to war with Britain. And so if you don't have the Japanese naval buildup in the Pacific, then you don't have that distraction for the U.S. fleet. Does that lead to a naval arms race in the Atlantic that ends up driving a war between the United States and the United Kingdom? And if so, how do we, after easily defeating the Brits, how do we run the place? because we know they weren't going to win.
Yeah, right. But even if it's an inconclusive war or of whatever taste, if we just have a more strongly
Anti-British
British sentiment in the U.S., that could seriously alter, because one of the ideas the connection between England and America, we have this idea, of course, now that it's a kind of an old friendship. But
that was not. Yeah, that really came. I mean, John Hay had a lot to do with that at the latter part of the 19th century. Yeah, but when you think what all that means, because that likely would have meant war with Canada, and of course, in between the two is Greenland. Mm-hmm. So Greenland and Canada might be.
That's could be a very dramatic shift. It is interesting to imagine. So you don't have this. Tsushima goes differently. You don't have this Japanese buildup, more American ships in the Atlantic, and then you have a war, because that's a war between the United States and Canada. The fights we did have there.
Well, I mean. Yeah. You can't say what happened in 1812 would have been the same that might have happened in 1912. Yeah, but it's a huge.
It would have been a different war to imagine. Fighting Canada when we have the border that we have.
If we had gone to war with the United Kingdom, would that necessarily have meant war with Canada? Given the length of that border, that's a war that could have been fought in the continent.
Maybe Canada wants to,
or there's Canada to join with us, because I don't know if they're mad. I don't know, but I mean there really was a concern about the war.
Maybe they don't want a war.
In the United Kingdom, and one of the reasons for the naval treaty was to prevent that war. And so if we were distracted by having to have a large Pacific presence because of the Japanese fleet, then does that mean that we have a larger Atlantic presence, and does that lead to tension between us and the British, which then also changes the whole 20th century?
Yeah, the more important question is how does this affect Sasquatch? Because as we all know, the invasion of Canada.
Yeah, if there had been a war between the U.S. and Canada, I think the real question would be which side the Sasquatch take. That could have been how do we get Sasquatch into the Battle of Tsushima?
The tipping point.
Now we found a way, because if you're fighting between the U.S. and Canada, Sasquatch is definitely in the picture. Yes.
Yeah, admittedly, when I was thinking about it, I was like, gosh, in a naval battle, it's a little harder to get Sasquatch involved, because we talk about different countries' Sasquatches. I'm like, what is the ocean's Sasquatch?
Now, other possible counterfactuals. What if before the battle that leads up to the Tsushima Straits, again, what if there's an inconclusive end to the fleet at Port Arthur?
That's true. I mean, Port Arthur was what should have been a winnable battle. There was just all sorts of mistakes made by the Russians there, but they should have been able to defend that port, which had a huge defensive mechanism built. So if they hold at Port Arthur, does that change the war? And because the real idea was that the Russian fleet was going to get there to Port Arthur, right? And then they were going to be able to protect Port Arthur. It was kind of the whole plan. It wasn't like they were going to go defeat Japan. They were just going to be able to defend the territory there. So, I mean, what if the war ends with the Russians hanging on to Manchuria? What if the war still ends? What if they still have a messy fight? What if they still agree that Japan has a sphere of influence in Korea, but Russia hangs on to those Pacific territories, especially Manchuria and Port Arthur and et cetera? How does that change the next century?
Yeah, because the lead up to World War I obviously is not as dependent on Manchuria, but the interwar years are certainly dominated by what Japan was doing in Manchuria. And this led to, some Western concerns. And I think that the United States was, they took a look at the occupation of Manchuria by the Japanese, and they were not pleased with what they saw. That obviously resulted in tensions between the U.S. and Japan leading up to the Second World War. I do like the idea that if somehow the Germans had been able to retain their limited possessions, that there might have been more of a focus on preserving those, at least leading into World War One, and then possibly even post World War One, if they had somehow held on to that territory. I really don't think that they would. I think that that's a bit of a stretch for a counterfactual, because World War One was largely fought over, okay, who gets to have what colonies where, as well as the question of who is the top dog in Europe. And clearly, it was not the Austro-Hungarians.
It does seem like even if the Germans, hold on to those territories and they don't lose them, to combat, they wouldn't have held them through the peace negotiations. Yes. It is a little interesting to me that one of the things I saw is that one of the reasons why the Tsar sends his Baltic fleet is because Kaiser, the Wilhelm, was just absolutely goading him into it. And he was telling Nicholas that, this will be the way that we will divide all the territory in East Asia, including British territory, and in this idea that his plans for future wars. He really had this idea, or he seemed to be pushing Nicholas to think that, that it was a victory that the Russians had to have. And so I saw some talk that essentially that maybe Nicholas wouldn't have done it, and that he didn't seem inclined to do so until he was convinced by Wilhelm that was the right plan. And I don't know if there was any shady dealing there. I think Wilhelm probably likely thought that the Russians would win. I don't think he pushed Nicholas with the idea that, I know the Russian fleet is untrained and unprepared and will be totally exhausted by the time they get there, and they will surely be defeated.
Yeah, because they're all related either to the Queen of England or the King of Sweden, right? And that is interesting, because we talked about the prestige impact and all that sort of stuff. What if it maintains the relationship between Russia and Prussia in a way that they won't go to war with each other? Of course, does that change? Because the Kaiser had managed to alienate too many people, and that's one of the reasons the First World War occurs. That if he was, we lose Bismarck, we end up with Wilhelm. Wilhelm is not nearly as good a diplomat. He doesn't understand that he has to be friends with either France or Russia, but he just can't get on the bad side of both, and that's all leads into the First World War. So this maybe impacts whether he stays on the good side or the bad side of Russia, which then impacts again does Germany go? And of course, if Germany doesn't go into the First World War, if they don't choose that, then there's the Second World War is an outflow of the First World War. So, I mean, what if we avoid the two deadliest wars in human history?
Yeah, does that mean we totally avoid those wars, or is some significant conflict?
Did that all really depend on the Battle of Tsushima? But I mean, I think as a counterfactual, it's not absurd to say that those were avoidable wars. I mean, in the end, they seem to be fought over futile reasons, right?
Yeah.
And so I don't know. Did there have to be a war for the final exhaustion of the Austro-Hungarian Empire? Could have gone down without war? I don't know. Could monarchy and colonialism have been destroyed without those wars? Because they were. I don't know. But I mean, could they have had some sort of natural death that avoided killing 50 million people?
Another, while we're talking about morally reprehensible things, let's also talk about the racism that is part of the entire story around Tsushima.
Oh yeah.
On
all sides on that one. That's
The Russians were definitely on the side that yes, these lesser Asiatic peoples, there's no way they could ever beat our fleet. And to be fair, the Japanese were those barbarians from Russia. There's no way they could beat our fleet. This, I think, has a lot of impact going forward. Even post World War One, where the Asiatic peoples in general take a critical look at how are we viewed in the rest of the world, and how do we view the rest of the world.
And of course, there was significant racism between the Japanese and the Koreans, and the Japanese and the Chinese, which were also pieces of the. But that was essentially the concept of Japan thinking that they had as much thought of they have a right to rule over these lesser peoples as I mean that's
it was, and so that goes into the rape of Nanking and everything goes later too. So yeah. And so if they don't have this great victory here, is Japan more humbled? Do they not believe that they are racially, but I don't know. I don't know how, because they'd be fighting with the Russians. That's an interesting question.
Yeah.
Is that did anything with the Battle of Tsushima have the ability to impact those racist attitudes that might have limited those racist attitudes, which then might have moderated decisions made through the rest of the century?
Yeah. I mean, when it comes to Japan, I think the big turning points here with Tsushima is that they were already looking, their imperial ambitions. That's the whole reason they start the war with Russia. And of course, Russia fights back. It was all over a relation, who was going to control Manchuria and Korea and stuff like that. The question is whether if this battle goes differently, if the war goes differently, because we are relying on that this war was not the only piece, or this battle was not the only piece of the war, but it was an important piece of, kind of the propaganda and the feeling of the Japanese people. Do they decide, to give up their imperial ambitions or even moderate them? And what does that look like? On the other hand, if they see their plans thwarted in Korea, do they just decide to double down on China? And that's it's an interesting way to think that if we all of these things we kind of take for granted in terms of how World War II went on had a lot to do with a battle fought almost 40 years before that a lot of people haven't heard of. I don't think this is a crazy unknown battle. I think a lot of people who are really into history know about it, but I would guess that the average person you ask on the street in the U.S. and probably most of Europe, if you ask them what is the Battle of Tsushima, they're not going to have an idea of just how pivotal this.
Yeah, I would say
really
many
was.
Americans couldn't tell you anything about the Russo-Japanese War and have no idea of the Battle of Tsushima. But I don't know. I mean, part of the challenge for us too is you don't know how everything is taught historically anywhere. So I would imagine it's taught quite a lot more in Japan. But how much would the average?
No, that's true.
Imagine trying to teach history in the United Kingdom. I mean, how much time you got per monarch, right? Per battle, per civil war.
I saw one talking about they were asking people in England on the street who the first king of England was, and just as with those on the street interviews in the U.S., it was a joke about how few people were getting
Imagine they're saying Alfred. I would hope that they would say Alfred was the first king of England.
They seemed to the answer they wanted was Ethelstan. So after
Alfred's grandson,
a couple generations after Alfred, but meaning that for people in America, when we're talking about the first president, we're talking 1789, and when they're talking about the first king, they're talking what is that, 900?
Gosh, do we know now? I don't know, but I mean, yeah, that's so. When you do the man on the street interviews or person on the street interviews in America today, and like the one they're asking people how many stars are on the flag, and they're looking and they can't tell because the wind's not blowing. I'm like, so imagine that in the United Kingdom where you have essentially. I mean, we were at a really cool castle. Its name will come to me. Anyway, I was laughing because at one point the king was coming to visit, and so they built a bridge for the king to visit, and that's the new bridge. The bridge was built there 900 years after the castle, and that bridge was built before the discovery of the Americas. And so, I mean, imagine how you got this much trouble teaching U.S. history. Well, that's just a teeny weeny bit of and that's why. It would be such a challenge to teach British history, and so how much time can British history put on the Russo-Japanese War? I don't know. I don't have any. If we have some British listeners, maybe y'all can comment about. Did you learn about the Russo-Japanese War, and what do you think? Because it did end up having large impacts on the United Kingdom, but goodness, there's so much history there.
The same concept is true of Japan and China, which have thousands of years of history.
Yeah,
in terms of the length of history.
It's very difficult to teach our history in any degree or nuance or anything like that. I mean, we have fun with the history guy and talk about all sorts of kinds of history. And I think there's parts where I talk about, say, British history that might not have been taught in a British history class. But I mean, it's an interesting challenge because every nation has their own way that they perceive things. I mean, the War of 1812 was perceived very differently in Britain and very differently in Canada than it's perceived in the United States. And that's a teeny little war when you look at the entire breadth of conflict. So it is an interesting question, and I think it goes back to us saying here. I mean, where is the Russo-Japanese War really? Because I would suspect that after the Soviet era, that they didn't spend a lot of time talking about the Russo-Japanese War in Russia either, right? So I mean, who remembers this war? And I mean, maybe only Japan. And how much is it taught in Japan? I don't have any idea. And yet it is such a center pivotal moment at the beginning of a century that would have so much history.
Yeah. Another possible counterfactual, what if Manchuria remains in Japanese hands? Japan never gets into World War II. So it turns into strictly a European dust-up. Uh, and you don't get the, you don't get that.
Well,
so,
I mean,
yeah,
the real question is if Japan gets into the Sino-Japanese War, the first Sino-Japanese War, right? So, I mean, it's their contact with the U.S. really depends upon if they're adventuring in China at the time. But you're right. If there's no war in the Pacific and it's just just a European dust-up, then go on. It's a different war, right?
Oh yeah, definitely, definitely. The Chinese economic superpower. The Chinese communists don't win. The economic superpower that is China today is not. Doesn't occur until, at the very least, later, if at all. Japan, in the 60s and 70s, instead of building cars and transistor radios, does become that major international economic powerhouse. So, yeah, again, a radically different world.
Yeah, it's easy to see because it's certainly, if Japan doesn't get involved in World War II, but still maintains, territory on the Asian continent, that does lead to a very different world. I wonder. I mean, without Pearl Harbor, does the U.S. get involved in World War II? I mean, certainly FDR always seems to have thought we were going to get involved in Europe, but the impetus for it certainly was, directly Pearl Harbor. So even without Pearl Harbor, if we're delayed from getting into the war for several years, I mean, that could certainly alter, and that's an impact that you could easily see occurring from the consequences of this battle. And of course that alters Europe as well, not just because whether or not the United States gets involved, but all of the European nations had territory in the east, and all of it was Australia and New Guinea and French Indochina, all of these, India, all of these places saw combat of one kind or another because they were fighting with Japan, and without Japan that means all of those. Essentially all of that doesn't happen. There's no German territory in the east, so there wouldn't have been a war in the Pacific at all. And that's not just the United States, but also all these various European powers that it could have impacted.
Yeah, my conclusion on this is that Tsushima sets up and validates the Japanese modernization and militarization and foreign policy based upon a sphere of influence where they control Manchuria and Korea. And without this battle, it is at the very least a rebuke to the militarist and might have, caused Japan to go in a wildly different direction. So again, even a draw at Tsushima, where part of the Russian fleet does get through, ultimately gets to Vladivostok. And Port Arthur is going to fall pretty much no matter what, because the Japanese land forces were just were dominant in the region, and they really executed a very, very good military campaign.
Yeah, Arthur was. You wonder by the time that before the fleet even gets there, Port Arthur has fallen. They were already pretty heavily committed in sending the Baltic fleet to Japan by that time, but they were also still a very long way away from Japan. You wonder if they had decided at that point that maybe it was pointless to send the fleet, that even then that could have significantly changed things. If they just decide, well, we're in Madagascar and the point of us sending it there we kind of lost that. We don't have the port. Because the whole idea was Port Arthur was the only warm water port the Russians had over there, right? So if they don't have that, I've also wondered, the Russians could have decided to try to get to Vladivostok or to port, to get there. They could, instead of going through Tsushima, they could have gone around and gone north of Japan. And I wonder if that would have been, in terms of distance, they had already traveled halfway around the world. That wasn't all that big a difference.
What if they had simply negotiated different bases? Or there's different ways. Yeah, that goes back to the start. And in terms of the other parts too, though, a greater Japanese loss in the Russo-Japanese War, if the Japanese had not won Tsushima and et cetera, would that have been the end of militarism in Japan, or might that have sparked a hyper-nationalist movement that would have been more militarism in Japan? And so we can still never. I mean, we can say here maybe this played a huge role. The Russo-Japanese War played a huge role in the Revolution of 1905, and it played a huge role in the militarization of Japan. But that doesn't mean that if we change the situation that you still don't get those. You might even get those in hyper forms.
Yeah,
right.
That's true. And in which case, maybe the war goes differently, but in not in the way we've been talking about. Maybe Japan is more involved and is more aggressive, and there's a war in the Pacific earlier than if they decide instead of attacking 1941, they attack 1938. That's a very different conversation.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the History Guy podcast. We hope you enjoyed this episode of Counterfactual History, and if you did, you can find lots more history if you follow The History Guy on YouTube. You can also find us at thehistoryguy.com, Facebook, Patreon, and Locals. If you want to hear more Counterfactuals, stay tuned. We release podcasts every 2 weeks.